Some cars are hailed as classics, their names forever tied to the open road. But what about the ones that slipped under the radar? Underrated models that never got their due, even though they had the potential to shine. These are the 10 underrated muscle cars from the 1970s. The 1971 Volkswagen 411 and 412. With Beetle's immense popularity, along with the success of the bus and fastback, Volkswagens saw an opportunity to introduce a luxury vehicle to the American market. But what Volkswagen considered upscale was very different from what the American buyers had in mind. The 411, with its blunt-nosed design, stood out as one of the most advanced air-cooled Volkswagens of its time. Borrowing the McPherson strut front suspension from the Super Beetle gave it a modern touch, yet no amount of metallic paint or plush carpeting could bridge the gap between Volkswagen's vision of luxury and the Americans associated with high-end cars like Cadillacs. One aspect Volkswagen did get right was including the automatic transmission as standard, which is a major feature in American luxury vehicles. Unfortunately, pairing it with an 80-horsepower boxer engine left the 411 with a sluggish acceleration, barely meeting expectations for luxury vehicle, let alone offering the power one might hope for in any car. By 1974, Volkswagen abandoned its efforts to market the Type 4 series in the US. The company's next attempt at the high-end vehicle, the Phaeton, did not perform better, even 3 decades later. The 1972 Ford Torino. The Ford Torino, along with its fancier version, the Gran Torino, was a major part of Ford's mid-size lineup. These cars competed with General Motors' stylish models, serving different needs. From a bold and powerful coupe made famous by Starsky and Hutch to a wood-paneled family wagon, even a simple but practical sedan, the Torino had a wide reach. True to its Italian-inspired name, the Torino carried over the sleek, flowing shapes of the 1960s while embracing the boxier, more aggressive design popular among vehicles in the 1970s. This particular version of the Torino was produced between 1972 and 1977 before being cast aside in favor for the LTD2, a model that leaned into a more high-end, refined image. While certain muscle car variants of the Torino have caught the eye of collectors, the model as a whole seems to have faded from popular memory. The 1973 Pontiac Austere. Everyone seems to remember the Chevrolet Vega and its troubled reputation, but far few recall General Motors' early attempt at badge engineering through Pontiac's version of the car. While Chevrolet was launching the ill-fated Vega, Pontiac had been working on its compact model, but instead of developing something unique, the company ended up with a vehicle heavily influenced by the Vega's corporate design. As if it wasn't problematic enough, Pontiac was also handed a barely altered variant of the Vega under the name Pontiac Austere. By 1973, General Motors had managed to work out many of the Vega's earlier flaws, but the Austere never gained traction. It carried a higher price tag than its Chevrolet sibling, and with minimal changes to set it apart, it failed to attract buyers in significant numbers. The 1973 Oldsmobile Omega. When badge engineering first made its way into the automotive world, it didn't cause much controversy. But years later, the practice became linked with laziness and cost-cutting. An example of this was the Oldsmobile Omega, a version of a widely available Chevrolet Nova. The Omega was a well-built and dependable car by 1970 standards. It had enough distinctions from the Nova to stand on its own, instead of being dismissed as just another rebadged clone. At this time, the biggest disadvantage of badge engineering had not yet appeared, but that would change before long, especially for Oldsmobile. When the Omega later moved to the troubled front-wheel drive X-body platform, the flaws of this approach became clear. The 1975 Mercury Bobcat. By 1975, badge engineering was still a relatively new concept, and Ford was just beginning to experiment with the idea. That year, the company introduced the Mercury Bobcat, a dressed-up version of the Pinto that attempted to appear more refined. Designers at Ford made an effort to set the Bobcat apart, giving it a more formal look up front with a boxier hood and an upright grille. But the rear end of the car was where everything took a humorous turn. In an attempt to create distinction, Ford simply took an extra set of Pinto taillights, swapped their positions, and called it a day. It was a move that likely fooled no one. Buyers certainly seemed to notice. While the Pinto remained a strong seller with 1.3 million units sold between 1975 and 1980, the Bobcat struggled to get sales. Over that same period, Mercury barely managed to sell 225,000 of them. The 1975 Ford Granada. The 1970s weren't exactly known for bold fashion choices unless you happened to be a free-spirited Californian. For most people, a business suit was still the norm at work, though some tried to add a little flair with long hair creeping over their ears or a wide eye-catching tie. In many ways, the Ford Granada embodied that same sense of stiffy formality, appearing upright and traditional while not entirely at ease with itself. Ford's marketing team made an interesting move by drawing comparisons between the Granada and the Mercedes-Benz 280. At first, the references were subtle, but before long, they became impossible to ignore. While that claim might seem absurd now, buyers certainly didn't seem to mind at the time. Between 1975 and 1980, nearly 1.8 million Granadas found their way into American driveways. And that number doesn't even include the nearly identical Mercury Monarch, which was just as eager to cash in on the trend. The 1977 Datsun 200 SX. Many people associate the rise of Japanese automakers in the US with the 1980s, but their path to dominance wasn't without its mistakes. Throughout the 1970s, there were a few notable flops, one of which was a Datsun's so-called sports coupe, the 200 SX. By most standards, the 200 SX was one of the least attractive vehicles of its era. At the time when Japanese manufacturers were making a name for themselves with reliable economy cars and, to a lesser extent, lightweight sports cars, this model failed to fit into either category. It lacked speed, handled poorly, and fell short of the expectations set by its competition. While Datsun was eager to promote the impressive fuel efficiency of its B210, the 200 SX had a very different story. It was far thirstier than buyers anticipated. A few that made it into customers' hands didn't last long, quickly falling victim to rust and fading from memory like an unpleasant dream. Yet, despite its failure, the 200 SX served as a lesson for Datsun. In 1980, the company introduced a redesigned version that, though often overlooked today, became something of an underrated classic. The 1978 Buick Century. By the 1970s, American car buyers were growing more fascinated with European styling, and General Motors took note. When the company downsized its mid-sized lineup for the 1978 model year, it decided to give certain models a sleeker, more modern look. This led to the creation of the Aeroback body style, a fastback-inspired design that was applied to both the Buick Century and the Oldsmobile Cutlass. While Chevrolet and Pontiac retained traditional notchback sedans, GM assumed Buick and Oldsmobile could do without them. The assumption proved to be a costly mistake. The American market wasn't as eager for these pseudo-hatchbacks as GM had hoped. The sales figures reflected that disappointment. The Aeroback flopped hard, catching GM off guard. From 1978 to 1979, Buick struggled to sell even 48,000 Century fastbacks. When a conventional sedan finally joined the lineup in 1980, the numbers told the real story. Buick sold 130,000 of them, making it painfully clear what buyers had wanted all along. The 1978 Ford Fairmont. By the late 1970s, America's growing fascination with European design was becoming more evident, and Ford's answer to the trend came in the form of the Fairmont, which replicated the Granada. Unlike the flashy, oversized, chrome-laden vehicles that had defined Ford's lineup for most of the decade, the Fairmont embraced simplicity to the extreme. Without unnecessary decoration, it was a sedan that focused purely on function, plain, straightforward, and honest. In many ways, it was a refreshing change from the excess of earlier models. While the standard Fairmont was little more than a no-frills model for transportation, the two-door Fairmont Futura had an unusual charm, offering a quirky sense of style that set it apart. Though the Fairmont itself has largely faded from memory, its impact lived on through the Fox platform it was built upon. That same foundation would go on to support the Mustang for the next 25 years, leaving a far greater legacy than the Fairmont's modest image might suggest. The 1978 Dodge Magnum. This vehicle was Chrysler's 1970s attempt at crafting a sleek, personal luxury coupe to rival the sharp-edged Ford Thunderbird of the era. While it might not have set the world on fire, one undeniably cool feature was its clear headlight covers, which flipped down when the lights were turned on. Despite its modern styling, the Magnum was built on a platform that dated back to the early 1960s, making it somewhat of a relic beneath the surface. It also marked the end of an era, being one of the last Chrysler passenger cars to offer a big block engine, specifically the 400 cubic inch evolution of the 383. Unfortunately for Chrysler, the late 1970s were a terrible time to be selling a 2-ton V8 powered coupe. Gas prices were rising, and the company had little money to push the Magnum through advertising. As a result, sales were weak, and the model faded into obscurity. Its successor, the Dodge Mirada of the early 1980s, fared no better and quickly met the same fate. What do you think? Are there other muscle cars you would have loved to see? Let us know in the comments.